Forever and a Day. Chapter 2. Teddy Dowling. To try and find the exact moment where everything started would be impossible, but it's safe to say that Teddy Dowling was as important a piece of the puzzle as any. Without him, none of it could have happened. Teddy was an average kid, growing up in a poor part of a poor city. He didn't know any other kind of life. He never knew what it was like to see his mother without a look of panic in her eyes because she couldn't afford to put dinner on the table. He never knew what it was like to see his father smile. To Teddy and his friends, the world of the 1930s was all there was and all there would ever be, so they lived as carefree a life as any child could under the circumstances. It was April 29th, and the afternoon sun was calling for the neighborhood children to come and play. Teddy was willing to answer that call, but he needed to stop at his apartment after school and let his mother know that he would be home for dinner. Ever since he was a child, Teddy's mother would worry if he didn't check in. Now he was almost 11 years old, and she still treated him like he was a baby. "Go on, run home and tell your mommy," called Timmy Price as Teddy ran off toward his home. Turning around, Teddy shouted back, "Stop being such a pill! I said I'd be right back!" Teddy turned toward his home and ran as fast as he could, never paying attention to the adults who were walking on the sidewalk, and nearly pushing a couple of older women right into an apple stand. He ran up the front steps of his building and politely held the door open for Old Man Gumfrey as the elderly man made his way out of the building. After a quick smile and a nod exchanged between the two of them, Teddy ran inside. He darted up the stairs at full speed and to his apartment. As Teddy opened the door and ran inside, he found his mother waiting with a glass of milk. She always knew just when to expect her son. "Why are you in such a hurry?" she asked him. "Timmy and the guys are waiting for me. We're going to play mobsters down in the park." "I don't like you pretending to be criminals, Teddy. It's a bad example for the younger children." Teddy shook his head and took the glass of milk. He took a giant sip and wiped his lip with his sleeve before saying, "It's just a game. It's not like we really shoot people." "What about your homework?" "Don't got none." "I don't have any." Teddy looked puzzled as he cocked his head and asked his mother, "You don't got any what?" His mother took a seat at the kitchen table and sighed. "Sometimes I wonder why I send you off to school at all." Teddy shrugged and gulped down the last of his milk. "Anyway, Ma, I gotta go. The guys are waiting for me, and if I don't get there soon, they're gonna shoot everything up before I get there. You be home for dinner." "I will. And no bullying the littler children." "I won't." Teddy ran out the door before his mother could put any more restrictions on him. He ran down the stairs and out the same door he'd come in, just in time to see Old Man Gumfrey step onto the sidewalk. He ran toward the park, weaving around the sidewalk traffic and eliciting more than one "slow down" along the way. When he got to the park, he didn't see any of the guys waiting for him. All he saw were little kids playing with their mothers on the swing set. He stopped and began to look around the area, knowing that the guys couldn't have gotten bored with the game already. They had to be around there somewhere. Just when he was about to turn around and walk toward the sidewalk, 3 of his friends jumped out of the bushes, holding sticks like Tommy guns, all aimed at him. "Put your hands up and don't move," Timmy called, leading the other mobsters toward Teddy. "Aw, come on, guys. I just got here," Teddy replied, putting his arms in the air, but he didn't like it. The smallest of the boys, Runt, replied, "Yeah, well, maybe next time you won't be late to the party, see?" As Teddy kept his hands over his head, the mobsters held him at stick point, patting him down and making sure that he didn't have any twigs hidden under his shirt. "Now you're gonna do what I say and you're gonna do it good," Timmy told Teddy with a snicker. "You're gonna stand up against that tree until we say you can move, got it? If you try anything smart, we're gonna shoot you." Still not enjoying his role in the game, Teddy made his way to the nearby tree that he'd been ordered to stand against, and he waited. Runt turned toward Timmy and said, "You think he's a G-man?" "Run it past Vinny the Weasel," Timmy glared. Runt then turned toward the other boy and asked, "You think he's a G-man?" "Come on, guys, I don't want to be a G-man," Teddy cried. "You be quiet, G-man," Timmy yelled, aiming the barrel of his stick at Teddy's head. Teddy shut his mouth and went along with the game, even though he would have rather been at home doing homework than playing the bad guy. As time wore on, the guys continued to play and shoot up the innocent younger kids in the park with their imaginary bullets, but Teddy remained a prisoner of the mob. He didn't get to kill a single person, and he was not happy about that at all. Even when he tried to stage an escape or switch sides, the other guys wouldn't allow it. It was getting late, and the park was almost entirely cleared out since the mothers had taken the younger kids home for the evening. Teddy was tired of the game, so he told the guys that he had to get home for dinner. After another round of name-calling from his friends, Teddy waved goodbye and began to walk toward his home. Along the way, he passed Old Man Gumfrey and waved hello as he passed. Teddy never made it home that night. It was nearly 2 years to the day since Norma and Maggie had died. Business was slow at the store, so Joe had spent most of his day staring at the clock, as though something important would happen at their exact time of death. He had a couple of days to go, so he imagined that he'd be staring at the clock for quite a while if he didn't find something else to do with his time. As he locked up the store that night, Joe dreaded going back to his own neighborhood. He wanted to settle into the back office just like he always did, and drink a cup of coffee while listening to the radio. Unfortunately, listening to the radio was pretty much the same as going home those days. Each time the news was reported, they were sure to include an update about the missing boy. Why him? Why did the news reporters care so much about Teddy Dowling when countless other kids disappeared all the time, and the press never gave them a second thought? Not that Joe was complaining. All of those kids deserved to have their faces plastered across the newspapers and their names heard on the radio for as long as it took to find them. No parent should ever go to sleep wondering not just why their child was missing, but why nobody seemed to care. What made Teddy different? Nothing. He just happened to go missing during a slow news day. A day later and he would have been pushed aside for coverage of the opening of the World's Fair. Now the press had a theme. They connected those two stories in order to tug at the heartstrings. And as you plan your visit to the fair, keep thoughts of Teddy Dowling close to your heart, and keep your children close at hand, they'd say. It was enough to make Joe sick, except that their sensationalism happened to work toward the greater good in this instance. Joe had known Teddy since the boy was in diapers. He'd watched him grow from a crying baby in his mother's arms to a boy on the verge of learning the harsh realities of being a man. And now Joe just prayed that Teddy could put those lessons to use. He drove his car to his apartment building and stepped out onto the sidewalk, looking up at the building as though he might see his family waiting for him at the window. But he turned away rather than go inside. He wasn't there to go home. He was there because his neighborhood was in pain, and he couldn't walk away from that. People still walked the sidewalks in front of Teddy's apartment building, though many of them seemed to fall quiet as they did. Joe remembered that same silence haunting his building for weeks after his family had been taken from him. He remembered the way people would bow their heads as they passed him. Now Joe watched as they did the same in front of the Dowlings building. A couple of the men took off their hats as they passed. A few of the women made signs of the cross and said a silent prayer. Even if most of those people didn't know Teddy or his parents, they all knew of them. Joe stood on the sidewalk outside of that building, and the sadness from within radiated from it like a hot stove. The desperation, the anger, the remorse. He lowered his head and allowed himself to feel those things for just a moment before putting them aside and reminding himself that they weren't his to feel. The strange thing was how few of those people who passed actually felt any emotion about it one way or the other. They acted as though they were touched deeply, but Joe knew that too many of them were simply there to see the place, as though it were a stop on their way to the fair. "It's a strange thing, isn't it?" came a voice from behind Joe. Joe knew the voice well. The second he heard it, the memory of that horrible rainy night flashed through his head. He closed his eyes and forced the memories away before turning to face Michael O'Shea. Michael was a detective now. A suit had replaced the uniform that he had been wearing 2 years earlier. The boyish glint in his eye never quite returned either, at least from Joe's perspective. Michael continued, "Seeing a place that you pass every day turn into a part of the investigation, seeing it turn into a novelty show. I never get used to it." Joe knew Michael well enough to like him, despite the memories that flooded his mind every time the two of them met on the street. He suspected that Michael could see those flashes of memories in Joe's eyes, because he seemed remorseful every time Joe looked at him, as though he were still repenting for some crime that he never committed. "I don't know how you do it," Joe nodded. "It must be overwhelming." Michael looked to the ground and shook his head, as though he had never even thought of the wear that his job put on his own soul. Instead of responding to Joe's comment, Michael asked him, "Do you I could use any tips you might have." Michael was referring to Joe's knack for reading people. To those who knew Joe, it was no secret that he could feel more than most people could. He could look inside of people in ways that not many men could. Of course, not many people ever wanted to say it out loud. Doing so usually caused all parties involved to become uncomfortable, and conversations tended to die down quickly. Joe looked around the neighborhood, more to see how many people were staring at him than to study the people. Though he always felt like all eyes were on him when that topic came up, they rarely ever were. "I don't know anything they haven't reported on the news," Joe told Michael. "Do you have any leads? Any idea who might have done this?" Now Michael looked around the area. Undoubtedly he was looking for reporters hiding in the bushes. When he found neither reporters nor bushes, he continued to talk. "I'd like to tell you that I knew more than I was willing to say, but the truth is, the boy just vanished. No who or why about it." "Could he have run away?" Michael's only response was a slight shrug, which Joe took to mean that Teddy could have run away, but it wasn't very likely. He then looked toward the apartment building's door and said, "I should get back to work." With a slight nod, Joe said his goodbyes, and Michael walked into the building. Joe was once again left with a sidewalk full of observers, one of whom got a thrill from being at the scene of a crime. Feeling that thrill made Joe sick. He scanned the sidewalks for that person, wanting to look them in the eye and give them a piece of his mind. The person he eventually settled on was a little boy who couldn't have been older than 9. Joe locked eyes with the boy and shot him a dirty look anyway. The kid took off running. The capital hadn't yet reached full speed for the evening. Joe expected the usual drinkers to roll in sometime after sunset when they could hide their actions under the cover of night and pretend that it never happened in the morning. Until then, many of them would be drinking at home. He sat at the bar, facing the handful of customers that had already settled in. None of them looked back. They sat at their tables looking at their glasses and contemplating the state of the world in which they lived. Then they took a sip and started the contemplation all over again. Joe didn't envy any of them. He pitied them. A few of them he wanted to shake and tell them to wake up because they could still make something of their lives. But on the few times he'd tried that, he'd gotten nothing for it but the drunken threat of violence. "Why do you come here?" Mary asked him, as she brought her tray to the bar and took off her apron. She worked days and served the lunch crowd, something which Joe had arranged the day he got her the job, though she never knew it. "I like the smell of sweat and desperation," Joe replied with a smirk. Vasya was standing behind the bar, getting her purse tucked away and preparing to start a night of work. She shook her head at Joe and turned to Mary, saying, "He comes here because he's waiting for something to change. He thinks that if he waits long enough, those men will put down their glasses and get back to their lives." "I hope they will," Joe replied, still looking toward the drinkers and not the waitresses. "Hope does not bring about change. Action brings about change," Vasya scolded, moving around the bar so that she could speak to Joe without anything between them. "Here we go," Mary sighed, rolling her eyes. She hated when Vasya got political. "I never said I believed it would happen," Joe told them, finally turning toward the bar. "I just hope it will." "If you wanted things to change, you would step forward and make it happen," Vasya told him. "But instead, you sell books." "Reading is important," Joe told her, knowing that his response would only cause her to get more riled up. Vasya glared at him and said, "You know what I mean." Mary got a puzzled look on her face and turned to Joe, asking, "Is that why you go to the Dowlings building every day?" Joe shot Mary a look and asked her, "Don't you have customers to serve?" "I'm off," Mary smiled in return. "Then don't you have a bus to catch?" Mary's smile grew, and it looked as though she was about to reply with a sarcastic comment as she looked down at her watch, but when she saw the time, her smile dropped. She grabbed her jacket and ran for the door. Joe smiled. Vasya moved closer to Joe and said to him, "You go down to that building because you know that he's still out there. You're not the type of man who forgets that, or lets it go." Joe pulled his cigarette case from his pocket and opened it as he asked Vasya, "Got a light?" Vasya dropped a matchbook on the bar, and Joe picked it up. As he lit his cigarette, he said, "The police don't have any leads. The family has no clue. The people on the street are scavengers looking for answers or looking for something. None of them did this. None of them." He took a deep drag and let the smoke leave his lungs before trying to figure out a way of finishing that sentence. But he didn't have anything left to say. Instead, he shrugged off the entire topic. Vasya didn't seem to have anything left to say either. As she prepared to head behind the bar and serve other customers, she stopped for a moment to give Joe a kiss on the cheek. "You don't belong in this place," she told him. "Nobody does." He motioned with his head, telling Vasya to get to work. The conversation was over. As she left him, Rummy approached the radio and began to turn the dial, looking for a station. "Hey, Rummy, how about you turn on the news?" Joe requested. Rummy settled on a station which was playing music and turned around to face Joe. Leaning against the bar, he told Joe, "You're the only one who comes in here and wants to hear the news, Joe. Everyone else just wants music." "Happy Days Are Here Again" began to play on the radio. Joe looked toward the end of the bar, where an already drunk customer was bobbing his head along to the tune. Looking back to Rummy, he took another drag from his cigarette and decided that he'd had enough of that place for one night. By morning, the atmosphere of the city had changed. As Joe returned home to clean up and get ready for work, he listened to the radio, where they were reporting on a ransom demand that had been delivered to the Dowling family the night before. There weren't many more details on the subject. Joe figured that the press had caught wind of the demand from a leak in the police force, and not because those in charge of the case wanted it released. He cringed at the thought. The press were vultures, willing to attack anything that might fill 20 seconds of air or a quarter of a page. They never stopped to think about the boy whose life might be put in danger because of their reporting. Joe stopped to look out the window as he tied his tie. From that point of view, he could see the street below and dozens of people on the sidewalk. Most of them had started to believe that Teddy Dowling was dead. Maybe they still believed it. They thought it was over. Most of them had probably gone on with their lives, feeling bad for the family's loss, but otherwise sensing no change in the world around them. Now there was a ransom demand. Those people couldn't convince themselves that Teddy had run away or fallen down a hole and broken his neck by accident. They had to accept that he was not only taken, but that whoever had done it was not finished with their community. Every stranger on the street could have been the kidnapper as far as they were concerned. As Joe looked out the window, he noticed that the one thing missing from that view was children running to school without a care in the world. Now he saw kids being walked to school by their parents. Things would be back to normal in a day or two, no doubt. People tended to have limited attention spans when it came to these things. It could be called heartless as easily as it could be called a defense mechanism. Both were true. Business was slow at the bookstore. After opening, one man nearly walked inside, but changed his mind at the last minute. After that, Joe was left to stare at a clock and flip through all of the classic novels that he would probably never read all the way through. All the while, he kept the radio on, just in case there was some break in the case that would lead police to Teddy Dowling. There was something he was missing. He knew that. He knew that the world was made up of patterns, and if he could just step back and take a look, he could see those patterns. He knew that whoever had taken Teddy couldn't have been perfect. They'd made a mistake somewhere along the line, no matter how small, and if he could spot that mistake, he would be able to follow it. Eventually, he would see how that mistake tied into some other clue that had been thus far overlooked. Some might have said that this was detective work, but Joe didn't see it that way. He based his observation on his instinct. He had tried explaining this instinct to himself as a compass which guided him, or a scent that he could follow, but neither of these analogies quite fit. He figured that he'd probably have a hard time explaining sight to a blind man, too. The clock was ticking. With each second that passed, Joe was that much closer to the anniversary of his wife and daughter's deaths, and he knew that he was also 1 second closer to hearing the fate of Teddy Dowling on the news. Each second that passed meant that Teddy was a bit less likely to be found safe. At lunchtime, Joe hung the closed sign on the door and decided to drive back to his own neighborhood. He wanted to walk those streets and breathe that air. Even if it would make no difference in the world, he wanted to be there. On his way to the neighborhood, he watched the faces of the men and women on the sidewalks. There was little emotion behind any of them, as people went through their daily routines without much thought at all. He parked his car in front of his own building and stepped out onto the sidewalk. This place was different. Even though the emotions were low, he could feel the stress. Their routines had been disturbed. Their lives had been shaken. For a second or two, Joe just stood there, allowing his internal scale to adjust. He closed his eyes and let the afternoon air wash over him. He took a deep breath and then felt the slightest sense of confusion, followed by amusement. He opened his eyes. Mary was there. "Who's running the store?" she asked him. "I closed it for lunch," Joe told her, looking at his watch. "Speaking of which, shouldn't you be serving lunch right now?" "I have the day off." "So you came here?" "I kinda needed to, you know. I wanted to show my support for the family. I can do that, right?" "Do you know the family?" Mary looked off and shrugged. She said, "I think I might have met them once, years ago." She rolled her eyes at herself and turned to start walking down the sidewalk. Joe walked with her. "I know it sounds silly, but there's a little boy out there, Joe. He's in danger and he's scared, and I just..." Mary trailed off, not knowing what to say next. "It brought back memories," Joe finished for her. "It doesn't make sense. It's not remotely the same situation." "It's the place. This street reminds you of them. It lets you feel connected to them. Now someone's come in and disturbed that." "So it does make sense." Joe smiled and shook his head before saying, "I'm not sure that any of it makes sense." Mary wrapped her arm around Joe's and leaned her head on his shoulder as they walked. She said, "I miss them." Joe could feel a tingling in the back of his nose and tears forming in his eyes. They were Mary's feelings, but he felt them almost as strongly as his own. Just as he was about to respond to her, a crash was heard up ahead. They stopped walking and looked toward the street. At the intersection, there had been a car crash. People were running to help. A police officer ran past Joe and Mary toward the accident. Mary let go of Joe's arm and looked at him with concern in her eyes, asking, "Should we do something?" There was anger from that intersection. Joe could hear people yelling at each other, laying blame on each other. Nobody seemed injured. Joe shook his head. He looked down at Mary and told her, "There's nothing for us to do." Just up the street there was a deli, which the lunch crowd was swarming around. Joe started to walk toward it with Mary close behind. "Come on, I'll buy you lunch," he told her. "I've seen the store's finances, Joe. Maybe I should buy you lunch." Joe smirked as he held the door open and Mary walked inside. The place was crowded. People were packed from the door to the counter, with not much room to move in between, and the steady buzz of voices made it hard for them to hear anything. As they stood in line, Mary looked toward the menu that was written on a chalkboard above the counter, but Joe kept his eyes on the ground. So many people in such a small place. Though most people probably didn't even realize it, there was a certain amount of stress inside every adult. Even if their minds were wandering and they weren't feeling much at all, there was an underlying knowledge of the work that they had to get done, or the kids that were acting up, or the bills that needed to be paid. It was as steady a hum as the voices that filled the deli, and while Joe was a lot better at handling that hum than he had been a couple of years earlier, he didn't enjoy crowds. "I think I'll have the corned beef on rye with a pickle. How about you?" Mary asked, turning to look at him. When she saw him looking toward the ground, she grew concerned. "Are you all right? Should we go?" "No," he replied with a forced smile, looking up at her. "I just needed to sort things out, that's all. I'm fine now." He looked up at the menu and studied the day's specials, along with their prices. There were times when he could swear that things were getting more expensive by the minute. "I'll have the corned beef too. No pickle," he told her. "Great. And with this crowd, we should be eating lunch by the time dinner rolls around." As Mary went back to studying the menu, Joe's eyes scanned the crowd. He knew most of the people in there. The Tate brothers and Mrs. Delancey, who lived a floor below him. He saw Michael O'Shea already eating his lunch at one of the tables. He never had to stand in line as long as he had his badge handy. And that steady hum of the crowd. Except there was something else now. Muffled by all of the other people inside the deli, Someone wasn't just stressed, they were nervous. He looked at more faces trying to pinpoint who it was, but there were too many people. He closed his eyes and tried to concentrate on that one emotion, hoping to get something more from it. People could be nervous for any number of reasons, but the other emotions that they felt along with that nervousness could explain a lot. Panic, fear, shame. He opened his eyes and continued to look from face to face. Something about this person wasn't sitting right with Joe. He needed to see who they were and what they were doing, because for all he knew, they were about to rob the place. Mr. and Mrs. Beach were just paying for their lunch at the counter. They were smiling as they talked to each other. It wasn't them. There was a young couple behind them. They weren't talking very much, but the boy was feeling hopeful, not nervous. The girl didn't feel much at all. She was probably just out for a free lunch. Behind them, a younger man, not him. Two older women, not them. Behind them, Billy Jenkins. Joe had known him since he was a small boy. His family had been hit hard. His father was dead. His mother was a mess. Billy was 17 or 18 now, and his eyes were darting from face to face just like Joe's were. Joe looked away from Billy so their eyes wouldn't meet, but he knew that this was the one. This kid was nervous, but why? He glanced back and saw Billy tapping his hand on his leg. He was growing impatient. Billy stepped out of line before it was his turn to order. He walked toward the door, but not directly. Joe looked ahead of Billy and saw a paper bag that was sitting on a bench near the door. Mr. Beach had set the bag down while he stopped to tie his shoe. Mrs. Beach was chatting with another woman. Billy grabbed the bag without slowing down and walked right out the door. Mr. Beach hadn't even noticed. Billy glanced at Michael through the deli's window as he hurried up on the sidewalk. Michael never noticed Billy at all. Joe reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet so that he could hand it to Mary. "Corned beef on rye with mustard, no pickle," he told her. "Where are you going?" she asked, taking his wallet while looking confused. "Just order lunch and meet me out front once you have it," Joe insisted, already on his way back to the door. As he went, Michael looked up and must have read Joe's expression because by the time Joe stepped outside, Michael was beside him, coat slung over his shoulder and hat on his head. Joe looked up the street, trying to figure out where Billy had run off to. "What's wrong?" Michael asked, looking over the people on the sidewalk without any idea why. "Billy Jenkins. We need to find Billy Jenkins." "Why?" "We just do. I can't explain it." While Joe continued to look around the area, he began to walk toward the intersection where the car accident was still being cleaned up. Police were all over the area, directing cars around the accident and dealing with the drivers, who were yelling obscenities at each other. "There," Michael called from behind Joe. Joe turned and saw Michael pointing across the street and in the opposite direction, away from the accident. Michael was ready to chase after Billy, but Joe hesitated. He took a moment to look back at the accident and the police who were surrounding it, before turning to Michael and saying, "You follow him. Keep a distance and see where he leads you." "Where do you think he's going?" "Joe, is this about the missing boy?" "I'm not sure, but I think it might be. All I know is that Billy doesn't want you there." "Where are you going?" "I'm heading in the other direction." Michael looked as though he wanted to ask Joe why he would be walking away from Billy, but there was no time to waste and Michael knew it. The men took off in opposite directions. Joe kept his eye on the accident as he walked. Something in his gut told him that the accident was part of the puzzle. The police were all over the place, and Billy didn't want anything to do with the police. He didn't go the other way because he wanted to. He went the other way because he had no other choice. If that was true, and Joe had no good reason to believe that it was, then that meant that wherever Billy was trying to go, it was past those cops. Michael O'Shea had been a police officer for his entire adult life. He'd spent years walking the streets, carrying a whistle and a billy club, chasing down crooks and hauling them into the station. Most of the time, they were petty thieves. They were desperate men or women doing what they thought they had to do in order to survive. That didn't make it right, however, and Michael believed that if we let the world fall apart because we hit a rough patch, we'd never recover from it. Panic was no reason to sell your soul. Because of his time on the streets, talking to the people who lived in his neighborhood and getting to know their families, Michael thought that he had a pretty good idea of what made those people tick. Most of them were good and honest. He refused to believe that the world was an ugly place, no matter how many bodies he saw on the street or how much blood he saw sprayed across a wall. Then there was Joe Oster, the man who hit rock bottom, lost everything that mattered to him, and somehow managed to pick himself back up. More than that, Joe picked others up in his own sort of way. In the past year, Michael had seen Joe find a runaway kid, talk a man out of shooting himself, and talk an apartment building owner out of evicting a family in the middle of winter. He did all of those things just by talking to people, and at least once without even realizing that he was doing it at all. On more than one occasion, Michael had told Joe that he should become a police officer, or at least a private detective. Each time, Joe waved off the idea and told Michael that looking for trouble wasn't his idea of a good time. To Michael, it seemed more like Joe didn't trust himself to take on the job. Michael, on the other hand, did trust Joe. That's why he followed him out of the deli that afternoon, and why he followed Billy Jenkins when Joe told him to. He didn't run as he followed. He hung back instead, allowing others on the sidewalk to come between himself and Billy. From the way the kid was walking, Michael could tell that something wasn't right. His pace was fast, but Billy didn't run. He looked around as though to see if people were watching him. Each time Billy looked in Michael's direction, Michael bowed his head and allowed his hat to hide his face. He knew Billy, though not well. Michael had been on the scene when Billy's father committed suicide. He remembered hearing the boy screaming to see his father, while officers held him back and his mother wept. Since then, he'd seen Billy here and there. At first, he would see the boy playing on the street, tossing a ball around with his friends. Then he'd see Billy with new kids, hiding down an alley and playing cards. After that, there were petty crimes, and more weeping from his mother as she picked her boy up at the station. After a while, Michael stopped seeing Billy around. He figured that the boy had cleaned up his act and maybe got a job to help out. He took no joy in following the boy down that sidewalk. Even if he had no idea why he was following him, he knew that it couldn't have been good, judging by the way Joe was acting. At the first opportunity, Billy turned left into an alley. Michael picked up his pace and hurried into the alley, stopping just before turning into it and staying hidden behind the corner of a building so that Billy wouldn't see him if he looked back. Michael leaned around the corner and watched Billy pick up his pace even more as he made his way down the alley. By the time he reached the end, he was nearly running, but as Billy hit the next sidewalk and turned left, he slowed to a quick walk. Michael hurried down the alley, hoping that he wouldn't lose track of the boy. In his mind, he was trying to think of where Billy could be headed. He knew those streets like the back of his hand. He knew the buildings where the crooks liked to hang out, and where the gamblers went on payday. He tried to imagine which of those places would be down that street, but none of it fit. He turned left as he hit the end of the alley and scanned the crowd. It didn't take long for him to spot Billy in the distance, still in a rush and not doing a very good job of hiding his nerves. Joe walked toward the intersection, keeping his eye on the accident that was being cleaned up and those who were involved. He didn't know the drivers, but he knew in his gut that they weren't the reason why Billy had gone in the other direction. The police officers were the reason. Even if there was no reason for them to notice Billy or go after him, something told Joe that Billy wanted to be as far away from them as he possibly could. As he reached the corner, he looked in each of the directions that he could choose to go from that point. There could have been 1,000 places for Billy to run off to, and there was no way of telling which of them would be the right spot. But Joe didn't need to be reasonable in his pursuit. The fact that he didn't carry a badge meant that he didn't need proof or logic. All he needed was his gut, and right now his gut was telling him to go forward. He crossed the intersection, already running through the list of buildings and people that he would expect to find down that road. He didn't figure that Billy would be running home, because anything that made him so nervous around the police wouldn't be something that he wanted to share with his mother. That left the usual haunts for teenagers and crooks, but none of those explained why Billy would be so nervous about swiping a couple of sandwiches. Joe remembered the emotions that he'd felt so strongly in the deli. He tried to conjure them up again, hoping to find some nuance to those feelings which would explain what was going on. When he did that, the thing that stood out the most for him was the shame. It was filled with a sense of worthlessness and stupidity. It told him a lot about the boy's mindset, but it didn't tell him anything at all about where Billy would be going. In the back of his mind, Joe knew why he was in such a hurry to find this place. He could tell himself that it was because Teddy Dowling was on everyone's mind at the time, but Joe knew that there was more to it than that. He had a gut feeling that Billy Jenkins was on his way back to Teddy, and that meant that Teddy was still alive. It meant that there was a chance to save him. It also meant that Billy Jenkins had crossed a line. With as much sympathy as Joe had felt for him over the years, there had always been the hope that at some point Billy would be able to pull himself together. If he was responsible for what happened to Teddy, no amount of sympathy would get Billy back on track. He'd be locked up and branded for life. Shame. Billy felt it. He knew what he was doing, and he knew how it could turn out in the end, but he was in over his head. Shame. That feeling that had been living inside of Joe since the night his wife and daughter died, because he knew that they would have still been alive if it weren't for him. The florist shop where they died was just up the street, and it had never reopened. Its owner had been struggling enough before he had a car run through his front door, and he was never able to pull the place together again. Instead, the shop was boarded up and left empty. It was a monument to the worst night of Joe's life. It was a hollow, dark, dank hole in the wall. It was the perfect hideout. "You have a nice day," the man behind the counter smiled as he handed Mary her food and moved on to the next customer. She took the bag and began to walk from the counter, looking through the crowd for Joe and mumbling to herself, "I'd have a better day if I wasn't left all by myself holding 2 sandwiches." She pushed her way through the crowd and out of the deli. Once on the sidewalk, she looked for any sign of where Joe might have gotten off to, but she saw nothing. He was gone. Turning toward the car accident, she began to walk, but she didn't know where she was going or what she was supposed to do next. She had his wallet, so she knew that he wouldn't go that far, but that didn't help her any. When she reached a bench, Mary sat down with a sigh and stared straight ahead. It would be rude to start eating without him. All she could do was wait. "You have the look of someone whose date has run off," came the voice of a man just off to her side. She turned to look at him, expecting to find an old friend or acquaintance that she wouldn't recognize by voice, but what she found was a stranger, standing over her with a smile on his face. He wore a nice suit, and his shoes were freshly polished. She noticed those things right away. "He's my brother-in-law," she told the man. "Not my date." "Glad to hear it. Mind if I sit down?" "Do I know you?" "I don't think so. I noticed you in the deli and you seemed lonely, so I thought I'd come out and say hello." "You thought you'd avoid the lunch line and see if my extra sandwich was spoken for. The thought had crossed my mind." Mary looked the man in the eyes. They were blue, with a hint of mischief in them. She wasn't sure whether that was a good thing or a bad thing, but she suspected that he saw the same mischief in her eyes as well. "You're very forward, asking a woman you don't even know if she'll give you her sandwich," Mary told him. "I'd be happy to pay you back for it." "All 50 cents? Corned beef? I thought those were 40. She raised an eyebrow. "You have to factor in the middleman. Don't I deserve something for my trouble?" The man narrowed his eyes and took a deep breath, considering her offer. He then shook his head as he reached into his pocket and pulled out 2 quarters, saying, "You drive a hard bargain." "These days you have to," she smirked, taking his money. "For an extra 10 cents, you can have a pickle." "I think I'll get by without it, or else I won't have the train money to get myself home tonight." "You're not from around here?" He shook his head and took one of the sandwiches from her. He told her, "I live across town." "You must really like the sandwiches around here." He grinned again as he told her, "Actually, I came for the view." "Darn it all," she sighed. "I could have sworn that I ordered the corned beef, but all I got was ham." Joe stood in front of the florist shop looking at the boarded-up wall and remembering the car that had been driven through it. He could see it as clear as day. He could practically smell the gasoline and hear the police sirens. There could have been 100 other places for Billy Jenkins to hide out, but Joe knew the world well enough to know that it would be this place. It reeked of fate. He looked from side to side, expecting to see Billy turn a corner at any moment. It didn't matter if he did, because Joe knew that Michael would be close behind. If Billy ran, Michael could chase after him. If he pulled a gun, well, who was Joe to second-guess the way the dominoes fell? There was no door on the florist shop. Instead, Joe approached the boards and began testing them, looking for a way inside. If Billy could get in, there had to be a way. Soon enough, he came across a loose board. It was still nailed in on one side, but if Joe pulled on it, he could swivel the board out of the way and climb past, and put it back without anyone ever being the wiser. The inside of the florist shop was dark. Newspapers covered the windows, barely allowing in enough light for Joe to see where he was going. As he stepped through broken glass and scattered pieces of debris, Joe turned back toward the entrance, knowing that Billy Jenkins would be there at any moment. "Hello?" he called into the darkness, immediately regretting it. What if Billy wasn't working alone? If he had help, Joe would have just tipped them off to the fact that he was coming. They could attack him. Even worse, they could panic and kill Teddy. There was no response to his call, but as he continued to walk deeper and deeper into the florist shop, he could have sworn that he heard the faint sound of something moving in another room. It could have been a rat or a bum making his home in the back of the store, but Joe didn't think so. He moved toward the sound, trying his best to remain as quiet as possible, but finding it hard with all of the debris that was on the ground. As he went, Joe grabbed a broken piece of wood off of the ground and prepared to fight anyone who might jump out at him. Nearing the doorway which led to the back of the shop, Joe heard another noise. It sounded like someone shuffling across the ground. There was also a faint, muffled moan, which could have been a small boy. Joe looked toward the entrance once more. This time, he was hoping that Michael would come through it and take the lead in this search, because Joe knew that he wasn't qualified for the job. He wasn't a cop, and he didn't know how to fight off any thugs who might come at him. He also couldn't turn away from his instincts, however, and they were screaming at him, telling him that this was where he needed to be. He walked through the doorway which led to the back room, ready to find whatever or whoever was making the noise, but he didn't see anyone. The only light came from one small window near a door that Joe could only assume led to the alley. The door was locked up tight, and there were boxes in front of it. He knew that no one had come through that door in a long time, so he didn't expect anyone to come through it now. He could turn his back to the door without feeling exposed. To one side of the room there was a counter, which was littered with crumpled pieces of wax paper. In the sink there were empty soda bottles. Joe could smell the faint odor of bacon in the air. Someone was living here, that much had been proven. Another noise. This time Joe moved toward it, waving the piece of wood in the air, just in case someone was attacking him from behind. He hit nothing. He saw nobody. What he did find when he turned around was a door, which was labeled storage in old and faded paint. He stepped toward the door and a wave of desperation came over him. He was scared. He swallowed all of those feelings and put his hand on the doorknob. As he began to turn it, the fear inside of him grew. Someone knew he was coming. Swinging the door open, Joe stood back and prepared for attack just in case. By this point, he had stopped expecting a big fight. He had come to expect Teddy Dowling sitting in the corner of the storage room, shivering and scared. Instead, he found Teddy Dowling tied to a chair in the back of the storage closet, gagged and blindfolded. There was a lantern, lit and sitting on one of the nearby shelves, so Joe could see the place clearly. Teddy tensed up and began to pull at his bindings when he heard Joe step into the closet. He was sucking air through his nose as hard as he could, but the place was dusty and that boy had been sitting in there for days. He could barely breathe. "It's all right," Joe told him, dropping the piece of wood and rushing to Teddy's side, pulling the gag out of his mouth. "I found you. You're safe now." There was no praising of God or exclamations of gratitude from the boy. He just began crying and shaking as Joe pulled the blindfold off of his eyes and the two of them looked at each other. The boy was relieved, but his relief was tentative. There was still a level of fear inside of him. Distrust. "Teddy, your family has been looking for you. The police have been looking for you. You've been all over the radio and the newspapers," Joe told him, before pausing to grin and tell Teddy, "You're going home." Teddy smiled and a tear rolled down his cheek. When he spoke, his voice was weak and nervous. He said, "I was on my way home from the park and he grabbed me. He pulled me down here and told people that I was his brother. I screamed for help and he told them that I was a brat and our mother wanted us home. I screamed for help." Joe hadn't heard any reports of a kid being dragged down the street against his will, screaming for help. That bit of information could have helped resolve the situation days earlier, but nobody thought to mention it to the police. Odds were they either didn't think twice about it, or they felt stupid for letting a boy get kidnapped in his own neighborhood. Either way, those people should have said something. Joe was growing angry at the thought of those people. He couldn't believe the ease with which they could sit by and do nothing as someone's life was threatened right in front of them. The knots which bound Teddy's hands to the chair were tight, and Joe was having a hard time getting them loose. He looked around the room for a knife, but he couldn't find one. The thought both irritated and comforted him at the same time. Having a knife around might have meant that Billy was planning on killing Teddy after all. Joe continued to struggle with those knots as the boy kept an eye on the door. He was scared. He expected Billy to come through that door at any moment. Even though Joe knew that Michael would be right behind Billy, he couldn't help but feel a little nervous. His back was exposed. For all he knew, Michael had lost track of Billy. He needed to hurry. Michael ducked into a doorway as Billy looked over his shoulder. He was nervous and desperate, and neither of those things was ever good when it came to kidnappers. When their backs were against the wall, they lashed out. Sometimes that meant that their victim died. Other times they'd kill themselves. Billy's father had killed himself. Michael kept that memory in mind as he followed the boy down the street, wondering how someone could go from being a poor, helpless kid to being a kidnapper. What was the trigger? Of course, he knew that Billy's entire life had probably been a trigger. Everything before that day had led him to this point, and all that potential that he had when he was a little kid was gone. Now his life could go one of two ways. He could die young, or he could go to prison. Either way, Michael was following someone with no hope at all. There were times when he was tempted to think about his own children as he chased down the bad guys. He wondered how he could be sure that they would never turn out that way, and he never came up with a good answer. Instead, he pushed thoughts of his own family out of his mind. He kept his world separated for the sake of his own sanity. Billy had walked past the street where the accident was being cleaned up one block over. He moved straight, never slowing down. As Billy passed them on the street, more than one person turned to look at the nervous teenager, finding him suspicious. But they all eventually went on with their day and resumed their own course. What else could they do? In his mind, Michael was already trying to figure out where Billy was going. There were a number of buildings with abandoned apartments, basements, or attics. There were at least a dozen empty shops nearby. There were shops which housed less than honorable businesses in their back rooms. The problem was, there were too many places for Billy to hide out. If Michael lost track of the boy, he would probably not be able to find him until it was too late. He picked up his pace a little bit, beginning to close the gap between himself and Billy. As he did this, Michael said a silent prayer, over and over again, begging God for help in finding the Dowling boy and getting him back home safely. Joe was out there, following his own clues or instincts or whatever it was that he was following. He might have already found Teddy Dowling, and Michael was hopeful for that. However, Joe was not a cop. He didn't carry a gun, and he was not trained to fight off criminals. If Billy found Joe in his hideout, he would likely attack. Michael amended the silent prayer to include Joe. The man had already been through enough. He didn't need to be stabbed or shot, and Michael knew that Joe would willingly allow either of those things to happen if it meant protecting the Dowling boy. Another block up, Billy turned left. As he did this, he glanced back at the crowd, and his eyes locked with Michael's. Silent prayers turned into spoken curses as Michael took off running as fast as he could, pushing people out of his way and screaming for those up ahead to move. Billy was already out of sight by the time Michael reached the corner, but he didn't stop running. He kept moving, yelling, "Where'd he go?" to the crowd. For the most part, people stood by and looked at Michael as though he were speaking another language as he yelled at them. Then, one sweet, precious little girl with a doll held close to her chest pointed down the street. Michael could have kissed her, but he didn't have time. He ran in the direction she told him to go, wondering why it was that a little girl could be so helpful, while a street full of grown adults were useless to him. Joe had pulled at the ropes that had Teddy tied to the chair until his fingernails felt like they would fall out, and he had made little progress. The clock was ticking, and he knew that it couldn't possibly take Billy Jenkins too much longer to detour around the police-filled streets and make his way back to the florist shop. He needed to hurry. "Come on, mister, please," Teddy yelled, crying desperately. "I'm trying. I can't get the ropes loose," Joe told him. Joe stood up and took a step back. He told Teddy, "I'll be right back, I promise." Teddy started begging him not to go, crying, "No, don't leave me. Please don't leave me." But Joe didn't have any choice. Unless he wanted to burn the ropes off with the lantern's flame, he needed to find another way. He wasn't in the mood to burn a child's flesh that day, so he left the storage closet and began searching the back room of the florist shop for anything that could help him get Teddy free. He ran to the sink and grabbed one of the empty soda bottles. He smashed it into the side of the sink, breaking it and creating 100 shards of glass. He grabbed the neck of the bottle, which was now the longest and sharpest of those shards, and he eyed it. He would have loved a knife, but there was nothing he could do about that right now. He couldn't waste time searching the entire florist shop, hoping that something sharp had been left behind. He needed to move fast. When he stepped back into the storage closet, Teddy was crying uncontrollably. The parent in him wanted to comfort the boy, but there was no use in that. Joe began slicing at the ropes with his shard of glass. It was working, but not fast enough for Joe's taste. "Hurry," Teddy cried. "I want to go home." "I know, you will go home, I promise," Joe told him, instantly regretting making the sort of promise that he might not be able to keep in a situation like this. The truth was, maybe none of them were going home that night. All it would take was Billy Jenkins beating Michael O'Shea back to the florist shop and shooting Joe in the back. Then he wouldn't stop. Teddy would die. Michael could die. Any number of people on the street could die. He needed to keep his emotions in check, but not all of those emotions were his own. He was in such a rush to get Teddy out of there that his defenses had been relaxed. The boy's panic was beginning to seep into his own mind. The glass slipped and cut Joe's finger. Blood soaked into the ropes, but he didn't slow down. There wasn't enough time for him to care about his own injuries. The rope on Teddy's right hand was cut through, and Teddy pulled his hand free, allowing the rope to drop to the floor. "One down," Joe told him, trying to sound optimistic even though he didn't really feel that way. There was a noise from inside the florist shop. It was a loud thud. Joe's mind immediately went to the loose board that Billy would need to move out of the way in order to get into the shop. Teddy looked toward the door of the storage closet with absolute panic in his eyes. "He's back," Teddy whispered. His chin was shaking. His eyes were blood red. Joe stopped cutting at the ropes. He paused for a moment to gather his thoughts. He felt scared. He felt hopeless. He felt stupid. Someone else was in the building. There was no doubt in his mind about that. And while Michael was a good and modest fellow, he was not the type of man who would consider himself stupid. Joe pulled his necktie off and wrapped the shard of glass with it, creating a safe grip. He handed the shard to Teddy. "Listen to me carefully," Joe told him in barely a whisper. "You need to keep cutting those ropes. You need to get yourself free, and you need to get out of this place. Do you hear me?" "Don't leave me. Please don't leave me," Teddy cried. "I'm not leaving you. I'm giving you more time to do what you need to do. Now, as soon as you're done, you need to go out the front of the building. You can't get out any other way. I'll keep Billy busy. Do not slow down. Do not stop running until you get home. Do you understand me?" Teddy nodded as tears fell from his eyes. Joe had to wonder if the boy had enough energy to run, but there was no other choice. Joe couldn't count on Michael to save them. Joe turned toward the door and took a deep breath to calm his own nerves and to push back the nerves of everyone else in the building. He leaned down and picked up the piece of wood that he had been holding when he first discovered Teddy. Once he had his weapon firmly in hand, Joe walked through the door which led into the back room of the florist shop, fully expecting to find Billy waiting for him there, but the room was empty. Trying his best to remain calm, he continued to move through the room toward the door which led to the shop. He hated leaving Teddy alone. He felt the level of terror in Teddy go up as soon as he was out of view, but all he could do about it was push it aside and keep moving. The closer to the florist shop he got, the more nervous he felt. He felt as though someone was coming for him, and his life could be over at any moment. Did Billy know he was there? Had he left some sign of his presence when he first entered the building? Would he be stepping into a trap the second he crossed through the doorway and into the shop again? He pushed those feelings aside, trying his best to regain his focus. Those weren't his nerves. They were Billy's. He was panicking. Joe didn't walk right through the doorway. Instead, he kept to one side and leaned through the door, just enough to get a view at the shop. It was dark. He could barely see anything at all. There were a number of beams and dark shapes which looked like human figures at first, but once Joe's eyes adjusted to the darkness, he saw that these shapes were merely old decorations. He continued to scan the room, but there was no sign of Billy. He took a step into the doorway and still saw no sign of the teenager. Another step, and another. Joe had managed to make his way into the florist shop without making a sound. It was only once he could clearly see the entire room that he saw Billy, standing by a window on the far side of the room, peeking through a tear in the newspaper that covered it. Billy was watching for someone, for Michael. He knew that he had been followed, but he wouldn't have returned to the shop if he didn't think that his hiding spot would be safe. If Billy had managed to lose Michael along the way, then Joe really would be on his own. Michael could see no sign of Billy Jenkins, and the realization that he'd lost the trail caused his stomach to sink. Joe was depending on him to keep track of the boy. If Billy had returned to his hideout and found Joe there was no telling what might happen. He stopped walking, trying to collect himself and figure out where Billy could have gone. It couldn't have been far, or else Michael would have seen him running when he came around the corner. His first instinct was to turn to the people on the street. Those people would have seen Billy and should be able to tell Michael where he went, but each person he asked swore that they didn't have a clue. Either they weren't very observant, or they were lying. He didn't want to believe the former, or else there was no hope at all for humanity. Michael started walking again. This time he walked slowly, keeping an eye on every window and every doorway, hoping to see Billy peering out at him. He saw nothing. Joe expected Billy to turn around, see him standing there, and charge at him like an angry bull. Each time he took a step toward Billy, the muscle in his arm tightened, just waiting for the moment when it would need to swing that piece of wood. Billy was staring out the window. He was panicking. He felt cornered, and that could have been very dangerous. Joe knew that he needed to act, but he didn't know what to do. He took another step. This time his foot landed on a piece of broken glass and it scraped against the floor. The noise sounded deafening to Joe, and he winced as he watched Billy realize that someone was behind him and turn around. As Billy turned, he was full of fear, but that quickly gave way to anger. "Billy, stay calm," Joe told him, though he knew it was useless. Billy was anything but calm. Before Joe could get another word out, Billy was charging toward him at full speed. The teenager roared as his fists flew through the air toward Joe. He was scared, and that emotion struck Joe before Billy's fists could make contact, causing Joe to hesitate. Billy hit him, slamming his fist into Joe's jaw and throwing all of his body weight against Joe, taking both of them to the ground. He kept punching again and again, trying to cause as much damage as possible, but he was sloppy. He didn't watch where he was punching as he attacked, so his punches were easily blocked. He also wasn't paying attention to the doorway which led to the back room. If Joe could manage to keep Billy's attention away from that doorway, Teddy would stand a chance. "Billy, listen to me," Joe called out, trying to find some way of reasoning with the boy. "It's not too late to end this." "I'm gonna end it," Billy replied, desperately trying to sound tough, though the tone of his voice betrayed his fear. In the struggle, Billy managed to grab onto the piece of wood that Joe had in his hand. He tried to pull it free, but Joe knew that if Billy took that piece of wood from him, he would start inflicting much more damage than he had been with his fists. Joe needed to take control of this fight. He pushed Billy off of him, causing the boy to roll onto the floor. Billy wasted no time in trying to get back up. He looked at Joe with hate in his eyes, wanting nothing more than to rip him to shreds. They got to their feet at about the same time, and Billy rushed toward Joe with no weapon except his hands. He swung those fists and screamed with rage, and all Joe could do to counter this attack was swing his piece of wood. Luckily for him, that was good enough. He made contact with Billy's gut, stopping the boy in his tracks and taking the wind out of him. He then shoved the teenager back to the ground. Truth be told, he didn't want to hurt Billy. Somewhere behind those hateful eyes was the little boy who Joe had seen playing in the street years before. He felt sorry for Billy. There was a noise from behind Joe. Billy's eyes moved toward the doorway which led to the back room. Without looking, Joe could tell that Teddy had managed to cut himself free and was trying to make his escape. Panic, fear, anger, stupidity, worst of all, desperation. Billy wanted to stop Teddy. He needed to stop Teddy, and in that moment there was no telling what Billy would do if given the chance. Joe could see Billy's mind working and his muscles preparing to rush toward the little boy. There was no more time to pity Billy Jenkins. Billy shifted his weight, beginning to move toward Teddy, but before he could take so much as one full step toward the little boy, Joe threw all of his weight against the teenager, driving him backwards as hard as he could. They crashed through the paper-covered window and fell onto the sidewalk outside. Shards of glass rained down on them as people on the sidewalk gasped and screamed. Billy struggled to get free. He landed a punch and managed to scramble out from under Joe. Joe couldn't help but fall to the ground. He struggled to get up and to stop the boy from chasing after Teddy, but he couldn't grab Billy in time. Before he knew it, Billy Jenkins was on his feet and prepared to run. Michael was moving up the street, slowly scanning each person and each building, trying to use whatever police senses he had acquired over the years to figure out where Billy could have been. Billy could have been a mile away by that point, but Michael's instincts told him that he was nearby. He just needed to figure out where. As people passed him on the street, Michael would show them his badge and ask them if they had seen Billy. He would describe the teen and what he was wearing. He would tell them that he was last seen carrying a bag from the deli, but nobody had seen him or would admit to seeing him. Michael looked at his watch. He didn't know what time it was when he first started following Billy or how long he had been separated from Joe, but it felt like an eternity. He could have kicked himself for allowing Joe to rush into danger like that, and he expected his superiors to be equally upset by that fact. But Joe wasn't a normal man. Michael reminded himself over and over why he trusted Joe. Joe could understand people. He could read what was going on inside of them like a book, and he could talk to them. He told himself that he didn't have to worry about Joe's life being in danger, because when the chips were down, Joe could talk just about anyone out of hurting him. A loud crash broke Michael's train of thought. He turned around just in time to see the crowd split, and Joe Oster fall to the ground in a mess of broken glass. Beneath Joe, Billy Jenkins was struggling to get free. As the crowd on the sidewalk began to stop and stare at the two of them, Michael tried to push his way through the sea of people. All of those faces who had shown such disinterest in his search for Billy were now watching the fight as though it were a championship match and they had front row seats. While those people watched the struggle, a younger boy pushed his way through the crowd and ran down the street. Michael couldn't see the boy's face, but he knew who it was and where he was going. He would find that boy later. Billy got to his feet and prepared to run off just as Michael reached the front of the crowd. He and Billy locked eyes, and he could see Billy trying to figure out how to get himself out of that situation. But within seconds, Michael had his gun drawn, and he was aiming it squarely at Billy. There was nowhere for the boy to run. "You're under arrest," Michael said. "I suggest you don't try to run." Still, he could see Billy's eyes moving over the crowd, trying to find a way out. But it was over. Soon, Michael made his way to Billy and had him in handcuffs. "So, tell me, stranger," Mary started in between bites of her sandwich. "What's your name?" The man to whom she had sold Joe's sandwich was chewing. He didn't respond right away, which told her that he was raised with manners. A good sign, since most of the men who showed an interest in her weren't known for their respectable upbringing. After he swallowed, the man told her, "My name is Roy, and you are?" She started to finish that sentence for him, but before she could get so much as an M past her lips, he held up a finger and said, "No, let me guess." Mary leaned back on the bench and allowed him to study her face, but she was skeptical. No matter how well he could read her, there was no way that he would be able to guess her name. Roy's eyes grew very serious. He tilted his head and stared into her eyes. She raised an eyebrow, wondering if this staring contest was supposed to be endearing or give her the creeps. "Your name is—" Roy started, but before he could finish, they were interrupted by the sight of a young boy running down the street. He was crying and dirty. Both of them recognized him at once. "Was that?" Mary asked. "Teddy Dowling," Roy finished before dropping his sandwich and jumping to his feet. He looked back to Mary and said, "I'm sorry, I have to go." Before she could answer, Roy had run off in search of the boy. She was tempted to follow. After all, she didn't know who Roy was or what he wanted with Teddy Dowling, but she didn't get the sense that he was a kidnapper, and the odds of the same boy being kidnapped twice seemed slim. More than that, she noticed the direction that the boy had come from. Up ahead, she could see a crowd gathered. Police cars were leaving the scene of the accident and making their way up the street, sirens blaring. She didn't waste time wondering whether or not Joe was involved in that scene. She knew him well enough to know that he would be there, right in the center of it. The question was whether or not he would still be alive. Mary had grown paranoid. Joe was her last remaining relative. She'd already lost both parents, her sister and her niece, and as she walked toward those sirens, she couldn't help but wonder if this was it. Was she truly alone in the world now? The thought scared her. She didn't feel old enough or qualified enough to live her life without a safety net. She knew that she would mess it up if Joe wasn't around. As she continued to make her way up the street, she couldn't help but realize what was up ahead, that dreaded place that tormented her every time she passed it. She considered the odds of Joe finding himself at the old florist shop, trying to convince herself that he wasn't there, but as Joe always told her, there was no such thing as coincidence. The world had a pattern and a purpose. If that's where he was, the pattern was clear. The purpose was another story. She picked up her pace as she went along until she was nearly running toward the florist shop. As she neared the crowd, she began yelling at the people in front of her to move, but few of them did. Mary pushed her way through the crowd, heart racing. She wanted to see what was happening, but at the same time she wanted to close her eyes and pretend that none of it was real. Police officers created a barrier between the crowd and the crime scene. They pushed back all of the vultures who were trying to get a better look for their own morbid curiosity. When she reached that barrier, Mary looked to the officer in front of her and said, "I'm Joe Oster's sister, let me through." "Sorry, ma'am, no civilians are allowed past," the officer replied. Mary looked past him, trying to see whether or not Joe was alive, but there were too many cars and police officers blocking her view. All she saw was the front window of the shop, shattered into pieces all over the sidewalk. There was blood mixed in with the glass. Her heart sank. "Please let me through," she pleaded, nearly crying. "Please." It was then that Mary saw Michael O'Shea handing a teenaged boy to another officer, who brought the boy to a nearby squad car. The boy was in handcuffs. Michael looked in her direction. She'd only met him a few times in passing and didn't know whether he would remember her, but she looked at him and began waving her arms, yelling, "Tell them to let me through! I need to see Joe!" Michael walked to her and nodded to the officer to let her through. As he put a hand on her arm and walked her away from the crowd, Michael told her, "I sent Joe ahead to the hospital." She gasped. Suddenly all of her worst fears seemed to be coming true. "Don't worry," Michael insisted, raising a hand in order to apologize for sounding more grim than necessary. "He had some cuts from the glass that I thought he should have a doctor look at, but otherwise he's fine." Her knees nearly gave out, but Mary was so relieved that she threw her arms around Michael and hugged him as tightly as she possibly could. "I was worried that he was dead," she told him, "especially here. I thought it was some sort of fate or destiny or all of that stuff that Joe's always talking about." Michael smiled and asked, "If you'd like a ride to the hospital, I could arrange it." "I would, thank you," Mary nodded. She then remembered what had caused her to rush toward the crowd in the first place, and the memory caused her eyes to widen. She grabbed Michael's arm and said, "The boy! I saw him running down the street. Someone should see if he's all right." "We've already sent someone to his home," Michael replied. "Now you go to the hospital and tell Joe that I owe him a beer after this." She smiled. "He doesn't drink much anymore." "Then I owe him lunch." "Yeah," Mary told Michael. "Come to think of it, so do I." Mary didn't end up taking that ride to the hospital that Michael offered her. If she was going to go there, she wanted to bring Joe something to eat. She had sold his lunch after all. She made her way toward the deli, walking slowly. She wasn't in a hurry. She knew that Joe would be tied up at the hospital for a while. Nobody ever seemed to get in and out of a hospital quickly, and it wasn't like he could leave without her, considering the fact that she had his wallet. As she approached the bench where she and Roy had shared lunch, she found Roy approaching from the other side. She looked at him suspiciously. You run off at the first sign of danger, she said. If I didn't know any better, I might suspect that you were one of those crime-fighting heroes from the comic strips. Roy shrugged off the comment and told her, I never read the things. You should. They're fun. I thought they were for little boys. And bored women who own bookstores. You own a bookstore. Sorta. My brother-in-law runs the place, when he's not busy saving the world. Is he another masked hero? Mary shook her head. He doesn't wear a mask, but he does have magical abilities. Roy didn't respond. Instead, he looked at Mary with disbelief in his eyes, which she found amusing. It's true, she told him. And if you buy me a sandwich, I'll tell you all about it. You're hungry already. It's not for me. It's for the hero. Then I definitely want to foot the bill for this one. Mary waved her hand toward the deli and said, After you, good sir. With a slight bow, Roy started for the deli's entrance. When he reached the door, he held it open for Mary, once again impressing her with his manners. If she didn't know any better, she might have thought that she had finally met a respectable gentleman. You never did tell me your name, Roy said to her. I thought you were going to guess. I've never been good at guessing games. Try. They walked inside and stood at the back of the lunch line, which seemed to have grown since the last time they were there. Roy looked at her with a furrowed brow and guessed, Doris. Do I really look like a Doris to you? You look like an angel sent from heaven. So what you're saying is that I look gullible. Tell me your name, and I'll buy you a pickle. And a soda? Roy nodded. Mary Daniels. Roy extended a hand, which Mary took. He said, It's a pleasure to meet you, Miss Daniels. The stitches in Joe's arm and neck pulled as he adjusted himself in the cot that he'd set up in the back of the bookstore. Even on a good day, the cot would not be comfortable. Now it was painful. He'd managed to get a few hours of sleep that night, but when he awoke, he felt as though he had never slept a day in his life. He wanted to turn over and pull the cover over his head, but he couldn't. He had to get home and clean himself up so that he could get back to the store before opening. He cursed the stitches as he sat up. He cursed them again as he tried to pull his jacket on. The day was not starting out well for him, and he hadn't yet seen the worst of it. Joe stepped out of his store just as the newspapers were being delivered. Morning, Joe, the delivery man said to him as he tossed a stack of papers by the store's door. Looks like you had quite a day yesterday. It's nothing, Joe replied, trying his best to shrug off the drama of the missing boy and the troubled teen who had gotten in over his head. I wouldn't call saving a kid's life nothing, the delivery man shot back. The words surprised Joe. At first, he wasn't sure that he'd heard them right at all. How could anyone have possibly known about what happened the day before? You're a hero, the man told Joe. That's something to be proud of, and nobody who has a kid of their own will be forgetting it anytime soon. With a nod of respect, the delivery man climbed back into his truck and drove off. Joe's hands were tingling. For a moment or two, he wondered if he was still asleep, or if the doctors had given him some sort of medication that might explain his delusions. Then he looked down at the newspaper, which had the headline, Teddy Dowling saved by local mystic, written across it. At first, the headline was just a shock. He never wanted any credit for saving Teddy Dowling. He had specifically asked Michael to keep his name out of the press. It took a moment, but the initial shock vanished as the full meaning of that headline began to sink in. He wasn't just being called a hero. He was being called a psychic. Somehow, the press had learned of his role in this story, and they had decided to turn him into a sideshow act.
This is the voice of the Embers, where stories burn and fade.